considered the father of the space program. Now, using the Freedom of Information Act, CNN's Linda Hunt has examined recently declassified information about these men and their activities during World War II. We call her series Nazis and NASA, the Paperclip Coverup.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
In 1969, America put the first man on the moon. Some of the people responsible for this achievement were a group of rocket experts brought to the U.S. from Germany after World War II under a project called Paperclip. Wernher von Braun was a major contributor to the success of the space program. Files obtained by CNN show von Braun was an SS officer during World War II, and there was a large-scale cover-up to hide the Nazi background of many German scientists brought here. About 1,000 scientists worked under Paperclip for the U.S. military between 1945 and 1957. Paperclip became established policy under President Truman to exploit the scientific and technical ability of German and Austrian scientists and to deny their skills to nations other than Britain. France, Britain, and the Soviet Union had similar programs. The U.S. military was required to investigate their Nazi affiliations to make sure neither active Nazi nor war criminals were included. Former Justice Department prosecutor Martin Mendelsohn on Paperclip policy versus U.S. immigration laws.
Policy did not override the law. Field agents in Europe who were told to get people meeting certain profiles of expertise did so without regard to what they may have done during the war.
The classified files of these investigations were buried in government agencies for decades. CNN obtained access to these files, declassified for the first time under the Freedom of Information Act. The records of the German scientists show some had been SS members, some were accused of war crimes, and the U.S. military employed 4 men tried at Nuremberg, including 3 who were acquitted.
There were safeguards and investigations what to be made, but in fact that was all sham. That individuals whose talents we wanted were brought in without regard to what they may have done in the past.
This was the group brought to the U.S. in 1945 to work for the U.S. Army. Kurt Debus, NASA's first director of the Kennedy Space Center. CNN has obtained this first security report that says he was an ardent Nazi and joined the SS in 1939. One investigation said he wore an SS uniform continually at work. Another said he turned in a colleague to the Gestapo for making anti-Nazi statements. Herbert Axter, who was during the war chief of staff at Peenemünde rocket base in Nazi Germany. A report said Axter and his wife had beaten and starved foreign laborers on their estates. Wernher von Braun, winner of NASA's highest award. In 1947, the first security report said he was a potential security threat and a major in the SS. In this affidavit, von Braun says SS Chief Heinrich Himmler tried to gain influence over von Braun's rocket work, and to continue working, he had to join the SS. This is Peenemünde rocket base in Germany, where von Braun and some others in the group worked on V-1 and V-2 rockets, the same weapons that blitzed London, killing and injuring thousands. Retired U.S. General J. Lawton Collins on Germany's scientific technology.
In some areas, they were quite advanced, particularly in rocketry. We had done not very much in this area, and they had an operational rocket.
Before the war ended, American military and scientific teams wanted to capture von Braun and his group so America could have their technology. Herschel Auerbach was one of the Army officers that first saw von Braun.
He turned himself in because he was running away from the Russians. And he did not want to be captured by the Russians. The Russians were out, they had teams out, actual teams out, looking for German scientists that they could bring back to Russia, and particularly rocket scientists, in order to build up the Soviet rocket capability.
Some of the scientists worked at Mittelwerk, an underground factory that used Dora concentration camp inmates as slave labor to build the V-rockets. Dora survivor Ellie Pollock.
There must have been at least a minimum of from 5,000 to 8,000 people that worked day and night shifts. And there was no way that really they survived too long, because it was long hours. Just to go in there and come back out from it used to take hours before they got the people out.
Von Braun made business trips from Peenemünde to Mittelwerk. In this 1975 interview, von Braun describes conditions in the factory.
The working conditions there were absolutely horrible. I saw the middle work several times, once while these prisoners were blasting new tunnels in there, and it was really a pretty hellish environment. Never been in a mine before, but it was clearly worse in a mine.
This is a captured German war record of a secret meeting between von Braun, other high-ranking rocket scientists, and the SS Commandant of Dora, former Justice Department prosecutor Eli Rosenbaum.
They discussed there, among other things, the possibility of bringing in a large number of French citizens from France to work as slaves. The document, which was captured by British forces, indicates, or I should say, it does not indicate that anyone objected to that proposal.
Yves Bayonne was arrested by the Gestapo for being in the French resistance and sent to Dora to work in the factory.
We were in the center of the mountain with no air, no anything, and we didn't go out, never. We stayed months and months inside, in the mountain. We slept there, we ate there, and we spent months there before going outside.
In 1947, fearful that State and Justice Department representatives would find von Braun, Debus, and Axter ineligible on the basis of the first report, Paperclip's director asked the investigators to review the matter. CNN has obtained documents that show investigators in Europe changed derogatory reports. These revised reports became the records submitted to State and Justice Departments for visa approval. In our next report, Arthur Rudolph, who left the U.S. and returned to Germany rather than face war crimes charges.
He was an ardent Nazi, and he was serving his Fuhrer. And he did it on the backs and the necks and the lives of thousands of innocent people.
And we'll hear from some of Rudolph's supporters in Huntsville, Alabama. Linda Hunt, CNN on special assignment.
Through right now.
Has gained access to recently declassified documents that shed light on the case of a top NASA rocket scientist who left this country rather than face possible charges for war crimes. Special assignment executive producer Linda Hunt has more on the Rudolph case in this part of her series called Nazis and NASA, the Paperclip Coverup.
Shortly after World War II, this group of rocket experts was brought to the U.S. under Paperclip, a project to exploit skills of German and Austrian scientists. Arthur Rudolph helped build the U.S. Army's rocket program and later rose to become project manager for Saturn V used in the Apollo space mission. In 1969, he was given NASA's Distinguished Service Medal. Then in 1983, the Justice Department accused him of committing war crimes 40 years ago in an underground rocket factory where Dora concentration camp prisoners were used as slave labor. On April 11, 1945, U.S. Army soldiers found the remains of the camp.
The SS had taken the time to stack them neatly, and we pulled approximately 500 out of about 5,000 or 6,000 bodies that were laid out that way that were still alive. I mean, they hadn't eaten. There was no question about it. They'd been worked to death practically.
Rudolph headed V-2 rocket production at Middlework Factory, where prisoners worked with civilian engineers building rockets. They worked and lived in the tunnel until Camp Dora was built. Then SS guards marched them daily to the factory. U.S. Army records linked the deaths of over 20,000 to working conditions there. Neil Scher, director of the Justice Department's Office of Special Investigations.
People were sleeping in their own excrement. There was malnutrition. They were dying of diseases.
Under Paperclip policy, war criminals and those active in Nazism weren't to be given U.S. immigration visas. Despite derogatory information developed for their files, military intelligence officials in Paperclip sent the State Department representative this document indicating Rudolph's record was clean. In 1983, the Justice Department confronted Rudolph with evidence of war crimes.
As the man in charge of the production, he was involved in the utilization of slave labor and had engaged and assisted in the persecution of innocent civilians. It's a clear-cut war crime under the Nuremberg principles and also under the Geneva Convention. The utilization of slave labor under any conditions is simply a violation of those conventions.
CNN obtained Rudolph's sworn statement to the Justice Department. In it, Rudolph admits one department subordinate to him was the Operational Labor Pool that coordinated with the SS the number of prisoners to work in the factory.
Rudolph was at meetings where they discussed very cavalierly the utilization and the requisitioning of more slave laborers to build certain parts for the rockets.
Rudolph said he asked SS officer Wilhelm Simon for more prisoners. In 1947, Simon was convicted and sentenced to life in prison for beating, killing, and torturing prisoners. Rudolph says Simon and he tried to improve prisoners' conditions by implementing a less strenuous way to get prisoners out of the factory after a shift, but we found no evidence that was done. Former Justice Department prosecutor Eli Rosenbaum directed the Rudolph case.
Here is a man who, among other things, went to the SS repeatedly, the dreaded stormtroopers, and requested that more prisoners be brought from the Dora concentration camp, from other concentration camps, that they be brought down to this subterranean hellhole to serve as slave laborers on V2 production. And in doing that, Rudolph had to know that many of those people would never return.
Rudolph told the Justice Department he knew prisoners were dying because of maltreatment. According to Army War Crimes trial testimony, Rudolph received daily reports from the SS listing the number of prisoners who died. In Rudolph's 1983 statement, he said his civilians didn't hurt prisoners, but Army trial testimony identified by name Rudolph's civilian subordinates who beat prisoners. And in this captured German document, the SS complained of civilians beating and stabbing prisoners.
These slave laborers were beaten by the SS. They were beaten by civilian engineers in charge of production. There were hangings of suspected saboteurs.
Rudolph told the Justice Department rockets failed to operate because of design problems, not sabotage by prisoners. Former prisoner Yves Bayonne worked as a welder. He says there was sabotage.
It was a common practice. I had a chance to be hanged if I was caught, but as I knew that I would never get out of Dora, so what's the difference?
According to Army trial testimony, civilian engineers turned suspected saboteurs over to the SS, who hanged them in mass on cranes in the tunnel close to Rudolph's office.
So instead of letting them drop like that and killed on the spot immediately, they were hanged very slowly. So this kind of thing is absolutely horrible.
In 1947 Army trial testimony and a 1983 Justice Department sworn statement, former Middleworks Secretary Hannelore Banish-Raft said it was Rudolph who had passed on sabotage reports used to target prisoners. After a visit by a Rudolph supporter, Raft now says Rudolph was an innocent man who wouldn't turn prisoners over to the SS. The Justice Department confronted Rudolph with some of the evidence it had obtained. He made an agreement to leave the U.S. if the government would not try to deport him.
He stated in the agreement formally, which he executed in my presence in the front of his lawyer and his daughter, he stated that if these charges were brought into court, he could not contest them.
Rudolph left the country and relinquished his U.S. citizenship. When contacted by CNN in Hamburg, West Germany, he declined an interview. Since he left, the Huntsville, Alabama City Council sent a resolution to President Reagan asking that his citizenship be restored.
We didn't examine charges and all those sorts of things. We looked at an individual and a group of people who had made a contribution.
City Council member Jane Mabry.
He had not been afforded things like the presumption of innocence, you know, and all those things that we're supposed to be guaranteeing to the citizens of the United States, which he was.
Oh, I think the Rudolph case sends a message, loud and clear, to every Nazi war criminal in the United States. The message is very simple. It's not safe here.
In our next report, more on Rudolph, and CNN goes undercover in Huntsville to find men who worked with Rudolph in Nazi Germany. Linda Hunt, CNN on special assignment.
Linda Hunt has details of what she found when she went through some previously classified documents detailing the backgrounds of several German and Austrian rocket experts brought here under a program called Paperclip. We call her story Nazis and NASA, the Paperclip Coverup.
The Alabama Space and Rocket Museum in Huntsville, Alabama held a reunion for a group of retired rocket experts who'd worked on America's space program. During World War II, they'd worked on Hitler's V weapons in Nazi Germany. This was the 40th anniversary of their coming to the U.S. under Paperclip, a project to exploit skills of German and Austrian scientists. Under Paperclip policy, war criminals and ardent Nazis were supposed to have been excluded. Now, the Justice Department is taking another look into the backgrounds of some of those brought here under the Paperclip program. The witness before Congress is Neil Scher, Director of the Justice Department's Office of Special Investigations, or OSI.
Has the OSI, during the course of its operations in 1979, been able to identify any specific or organized program which resulted in U.S. government agencies providing immigration assistance to Nazis and their collaborators?
Well, we have come in, obviously, in contact with Project Paperclip, which is the most obvious one.
Is that the only such program you've encountered during your investigation of prospective?
That is the one we have in fact been dealt with, a project that was dealing specifically with bringing in Nazis.
Some men who attended the reunion are under investigation by the Justice Department in connection with their wartime activities in Middlework, an underground rocket factory that used concentration camp prisoners as slave labor. Army trial records show at least 20,000 died. They were starved, died of disease, and were literally worked to death. Records show some civilian engineers at the factory beat and stabbed them, and some were hanged as a result of civilians turning them over to the SS. This is Dieter Grau, who, like most of those under investigation, lives in Huntsville, where he worked for the Army at Redstone Arsenal and later for NASA as director of a lab at the Marshall Space Flight Center. We went to see Grau to ask him about a trip he'd made during the war to the Middlework underground factory.
I promised that I wouldn't make any further statements on the subject.
Grau's Paperclip files show during World War II he was at Peenemünde Rocket Base. But during the Justice Department's interrogation of Arthur Rudolph, who left the U.S. rather than face war crimes charges, a trip Grau made to the underground factory was discussed. Grau checked rocket failures, and the interrogator quotes him as saying prisoners who didn't have the right attitude sabotaged them by loosening screws. Army trial records show prisoners were hanged as a result of civilians turning suspected saboteurs over to the SS. Last May, Grau reportedly told Atlanta Weekly he'd turned in a sabotage report. Another NASA engineer who worked at the Nazi underground factory is Eric Ball. Arthur Rudolph also told the Justice Department that Ball would have been in charge of Grau's checking rockets in the factory. We went to see Ball at his home in Huntsville, but no one answered the door. His wife later said on the phone he was too ill to talk. In this 1947 sworn statement, Ball says he saw German civilians beat prisoners in the factory. Werner Voss was a technical assistant at NASA until 1974. We found Voss's home in Huntsville and went to see him with his sworn interrogation. In it, he describes two mass hangings of prisoners on cranes in the factory's tunnel.
I have this interrogation of you in 1947.
Yeah.
Could I ask you some questions about working at Middlework?
No, I did not work at Middlework.
You said you didn't work at Middlework?
I did not.
Huh. Why does this say that you did here?
I was in business.
But Voss's sworn interrogation shows he worked at the factory from July 1944 until April 1945. Gunter Huckall was a branch chief at NASA. We found him at his home in Huntsville, but he wouldn't talk. Documents show he was a factory superintendent at the Middlework Underground factory from 1943 until near the end of the war. Military intelligence documents show he was a member of the SS Flyers and later the Civil SS and an early Nazi Party member. Files obtained by CNN show there was a large-scale cover-up to hide the Nazi background of many German scientists brought here. Huckall was one of them. In 1947, background investigations of past Nazi activities judged him a potential security threat. Fearing that State and Justice Department representatives would find him ineligible for a visa, Paperclip's director asked investigators to review the matter. As a result, his derogatory report was changed. In Huntsville, Justice Department investigations made some at this reunion nervous. One not known to be under investigation is Ernst Stuhlinger.
It would be wrong if I said that I am not scared for some of my friends, not because I would know of anything particular,
but simply because I see that a huge machine is beginning to roll here and to build up momentum, and that's always an unfortunate situation.
In our next report, 4 men employed under Paperclip who were tried at Nuremberg. Linda Hunt, CNN on special assignment.
If everyone was all right.
Special assignment executive producer Linda Hunt has the details in this investigative report called Nazis and NASA, the Paperclip Coverup.
After World War II, the U.S. Air Force employed German jet aircraft and aeromedicine experts under Paperclip, a project to exploit skills of German and Austrian scientists. 3 who worked at the U.S. Aero Center in Heidelberg, West Germany, were Siegfried Roof, Hermann Becker-Freising, and Konrad Schaefer. They were paid to write reports or conduct lab tests based on their wartime research. But Nuremberg war crimes prosecutors later charged they conducted experiments on humans during the war. Chief of Counsel Telford Taylor.
The wrongs which we seek to condemn and punish have been so calculated, so malignant, and so devastating that civilization cannot tolerate their being ignored.
Siegfried Roof was accused of conducting high-altitude experiments on Dachau prisoners. Taylor read a report about what happened to a Jewish delicatessen clerk whose air was cut off.
The yells aloud, convulses his arms and legs, grimaces, bites his tongue, does not respond to speech, gives the impression of someone who is completely out of his mind.
Roof was acquitted, but the court said evidence created a grave suspicion he was implicated in the experiments. Becker-Freising and Schaefer were accused of conducting Dachau experiments where prisoners were given only seawater to drink. Some died. Becker-Freising was convicted of war crimes and sent to jail. Schaefer was acquitted. After working a short while under Paperclip at Randolph Field, Texas, the Air Force returned him to Germany. In 1949, the U.S. military expressed interest in hiring some German scientists even though they'd been convicted of war crimes. Otto Ambros ran a factory at Auschwitz and was convicted of war crimes. In 1949, the Air Force asked Paperclip officials if Ambros and 3 others could be hired when they got out of jail. Though they weren't brought to the U.S., Ambros was later hired abroad by American companies, including W.R. Grace, whose president, Peter Grace, heads an advisory committee for President Reagan. Ambros told CNN he's still working for American companies, but they don't want him to talk. Congressman Tom Lantos.
Here was a man who, in a court of law, was convicted of mass murder. And I have really no reaction except disdain for people who went out on a limb to try to involve them in their own private business ventures.
CNN obtained documents that show a wide-scale cover-up to exclude derogatory information about the Nazi backgrounds of some scientists. In 1951, after signing a Paperclip contract in Europe, the Army was going to bring Kurt Blom to Fort Detrick, Maryland. Although his Paperclip files said he'd never been arrested, he'd been tried at Nuremberg and accused of conducting medical experiments and exterminations. Although acquitted, Blom admitted to military intelligence he'd planned to conduct experiments on humans, another fact not mentioned in his Paperclip file. After the State Department denied him a visa, the Army employed him as a doctor at Camp King in Oberursel, West Germany. In 1947, European investigators sent Paperclip officials reports that said some scientists were ardent Nazis and security threats. Fearing that State and Justice Department representatives would deny them visas, Paperclip officials asked investigators to review the matter, and the records were changed. The revised reports became part of the records sent to State and Justice Departments for visa approval. Former Congresswoman Elizabeth Holtzman authored the law that now requires Nazi war criminals be deported.
If we have agencies of this government willing to deliberately overlook and violate presidential directives, if we have government agencies willing to deceive other government agencies, if we have government agencies willing to lie to the Congress in order to protect Nazi war criminals, then we have a very, very serious problem here.
Army Colonel Monty Cohn was with a division in the War Department that worked with the intelligence agency that ran Paperclip. I went to his home in Virginia to ask him about the change of Paperclip personnel reports. I said it appeared to us that some reports showed they were ardent Nazis and were later changed to say they weren't.
Yes, that's right, I think. I'm not aware of any single case that was established that the guy was an ardent Nazi. Most of them were just affiliated with the party because they had to be.
When I showed him specific files, he said he didn't remember them. I asked him if President Truman was aware of some of the people brought here in spite of derogatory information against them.
Well, I don't think that individual cases went to White House level. And as far as I know, the guidelines were very carefully followed because there was so much publicity on this program at the time. And there was great feeling, of course, in the country. Some elements opposed the program vehemently. I didn't understand what we were trying to do. Now it's clear the results we had. But I couldn't possibly give you any information on those cases.
A bill is pending in Congress to set up a committee to investigate U.S. agencies helping Nazi war criminals immigrate to America.
President Truman at that time said that even the needs of the United States for scientific advancement did not require and should not involve the use of Nazi war criminals. Those decisions were made publicly, and yet privately and secretly, the laws were subverted. Privately and secretly, presidential directives were subverted, and that, I think, is the real danger here.
Linda Hunt, CNN on special assignment.
Well, spring is officially about